it's Shirley Adams for the Sewing Connection, Series 16, Program 5. You've probably noticed how I gravitate towards structured clothing, jackets and vests and garments with a lot of body. There's a good reason for this. I travel a lot with maybe over 100 garments for seminars, and these styles never fail me. When they're unpacked, just a quick shake and hang them on a rack and they're ready to go without pressing. The reason for this is the understructure, the interfacings, the bare bones of fashion. The confusion comes when you try to decide which type to use for a particular fabric and style, and then how to apply it. I'm going to show you a bunch of garments, and we're going to group them so that you can kind of see what's going on and see how I'm making some decisions. Now, first of all, look at the models, and we are going to see 4 of them, and they're all going to be wearing the same basic garment. What this is these are tailored suits, and you keep asking me these questions, so I showed these 4 just to show you it makes no difference that one is leather, another is silk, there's a suede and a wool, and all 4 of these can use the same interfacing in them. Now what that interfacing is, I'll show you in a little bit, but where that interfacing is while we have the models here, it's going to completely cover, because this is strict tailoring, it's going to completely cover the front, all the way from the top to the bottom and side to side, the complete front, so that it supports the shoulder area and buttons and buttonholes and whatever other structural design might be there, pockets, anything that's there, it supports it, and it keeps that front looking nice and crisp. It will also be across the back shoulders and not throughout the whole back in most cases. We're going to have some in the hems, and that's going to be a bias strip, and I'll show you how to do that later. And this is what I want, the maximum amount. Typically, your pattern doesn't give that amount, and so I just go ahead and cut out the same pattern that I use for the front of the jacket. I just cut it out a second time in the interfacing. Now what I would use for that is, by all means, a fusible anytime I can. That's my preference, because it's going to be quicker and easier. And it's nice for you if you don't have a whole lot of experience, because even a rank amateur can do a really good job with these fusibles and make them look very professional. And professional is the goal in all this. You want them to really look like they are just super. Well, here are going to be my choices. Now, one, down on the bottom I have a bolt of it, because I actually do get it by the bolt. I use so much of this stuff that I like to have it there. I also sew in the middle of the night very often. And you know, fabric shop owners aren't very good about opening their doors at 3 in the morning, so I like to have it on hand. Now, any of these interfacings always come in neutral colors, of course. And typically they're in white and charcoal and maybe some medium gray, so that whether you have light or dark or white fabric, it'll suit whichever it is. What I have here, what I would debate about in making these suits, I would try to decide whether I want to use this, and it's a fairly new one. This is a satin weave, and I'm mentioning the actual brand names because there's no other way to describe them. This is called satin weave, and it does have a satiny look to it. It is a really nice looking one. It's fairly new, and it fuses at a little cooler temperature, so that's nice if you have a fabric that won't take the higher heat of some of the fusible interfacings. So read the label. They always tell you what it's going to be for, and this is going to give you a lot of information. Another one that's new that I might consider, and these are considered the new top-of-the-line couture interfacings. This is flex weave, and this is another one that might be just the thing. It gives a little firmer control. Both of these give kind of firm control for that strict tailoring that you saw in all those 4 suits. This one down here has been on the market for a long, long time. It's an old reliable that I use so much of. It's called Armo Weft, and I use that. It's a weft construction is why. So I use a whole lot of that. So these are what I debate about for that strict tailoring. So once we decide on that, and then I'll show you later how I define it down to 1 or narrow it down to 1. Okay, then we have another group of garments I'd like you to see on models, and these garments are all soft tailoring. They're still tailored suits, but they're soft tailoring. Notice how the pink one has just gathers at the waist. It's kind of soft. The silver one has some tucks at the waist, but it's not tailored darts like the first group of suits were. And The others are also just sort of soft. The tomato colored one, that's just belted. So it's soft tailoring. You don't want that much interfacing as we had in the first. What I would use there is only up and down the front where there are buttons and buttonholes. Definitely you need to have the interfacing there. You need it always also in the shoulder. And then I want a little bit under the arm to support it as it goes around to the back shoulders, but it's just an abbreviated amount. It doesn't cover the whole front. Then of course in that also I'm probably going to have some in the hem, probably, depending on what the hem is and how it ends down there. One of my favorites for that is this fusee knit. This has also been on the market for, a long time, and it's still a great interfacing. Now what this is a knit tricot, and I would use it. Now these are mostly woven fabrics that you are seeing, but I'd still put the knits with the wovens. It really doesn't matter. Now this is not as firm as the first group, but it gives a nice amount of interfacing for any of those that you saw. Then let's look at another group, and these are a little bit different. These are vests, obviously, and they all really need fusible for various reasons. Now 3 of these are wrinkled, and that wrinkled fabric is only going to stay in place and stay in shape because the fusible interfacing under it holds it all there. And they're wrinkled in various ways, but that fusible interfacing is really necessary. For the red one, I must admit, I could just as easily have had a sew-in interfacing because it isn't holding wrinkles. It's only reinforcing the vest and giving it some body, giving it a nice crisp look, and also it helps to do that machine embroidery, that automatic embroidery that I did on my Janome. And you can do that more easily, of course, when there's a nice interfacing. Besides that interfacing, if you're going to do embroidery, you'll probably need some stabilizer of some sort just to make sure everything stays out nice and crisp and stiffly in place while you do the embroidering, and then remove the stabilizer later. Well, my choices for those things would be the same as the last group of soft tailored suits. It would probably also be that fusee knit or something of that weight or something of that character that holds together about the same way. But again, I might test it out to make sure I know what I want. Then there's still another group, and these are going to be things that you'll see on the models that are softer. It's going to be a group of blouses and dresses, and here you certainly don't want that heavier interfacing, so we're going lighter. So again, it's deciding what's going to be suitable for it, and not the same one for every one. Some of the fabrics, there are some blouses there, and there is a dress. And of course, where we will use interfacing, as you can guess, is in the collar and cuffs of the blouses. Any place there are buttons and buttonholes will need to reinforce with interfacing, and the same for the dress. So any of these will have interfacing in about the same places, and they will use pretty much the same type of interfacings. Now here again, there are sew-ins available for every one of them, but my personal choice is, because it's so much easier, to use the fusibles. Now some of these fabrics that you use may not be good with the standard fusibles that have been on the market for a long time, because maybe they don't take very much heat. So if that's the case, there are some new fusibles that are lower heat, and Touch of Gold is one of them. You don't want very much heat there, so that might be a good choice. But I like to try all 3 of these on whatever fabric I'm using to see how it works out. So for those, I might use Touch of Gold, white, black. It comes in a variety of neutrals. Or I might use So Sheer, and it really is sheer. It's very similar to that fusible tricot in the last group, but it's not nearly as heavy. It's really quite sheer. If I can get down to a single layer, it's barely there. So that works out nicely. Then down here I have Soft Brush, and this one has a brushed surface, is why it's called that, but it's also a knit tricot, and any of those might do, and they don't always feel the difference, but any of them might do well in these blouses and dresses. You don't know until you fuse a little sample of them exactly how they're going to behave and feel, and so you really need to do that. I don't ever try to outguess it. I always try a little sample to make sure I know what I'm doing and that I'm going to be happy with the results before I proceed on the actual garment. Then we have another group of garments that I want you to see on the models, and these are going to be the quilted things. And so the quilteds that I have inside these garments are different on every one of them. It might be a not a fusible fleece. These are all sew-ins, and on one of them it might be just a sew-in fleece. On another I might even have some cotton flannel, or I might have whatever else to give a little loft, to give some body, to hold all these together. Do I ever make a mistake? If you're wondering that, I will readily admit, and I very often bring my mistakes with me to show. If I have ever made any mistakes with quilteds, for instance, I like a volunteer to hold up her hand, such as this volunteer, because what happened here is it's too stiff. If it can hold up its hand, it's too stiff. Now look at all the stitching that's all over this, all this channel quilting. Tons of rows of stitching there in metallic threads. You could take all that stitching out and put one that's more suitable, that won't stiffen it this much. If you have that much time, I wish I could buy some of it from you, because that would take too much time. So some mistakes I simply live with. When this is handled enough and when it's worn enough, it will soften up eventually, and so it'll be all right. So even though I tried that on a little sample, I didn't guess just right. A small sample didn't tell me that the big thing is going to end up kind of stiff. Now what I definitely would not use, here's the fusible or the sew-in fleece that I have in it. What I definitely wouldn't use in any garments is this fusible fleece. Now I couldn't live without this. I have several packages of it at home, and what I use this for is the craft projects. The bags and belts, all of these things do well only because they have this fusible fleece in them. And this is what really stiffens them. It gives them a lot of body, because here, for instance, I have scarf fabrics, really thin silks. You couldn't make a bag out of that is stiff enough to hold up unless you had those stiff fusibles inside. Not only do I have that fusible interfacing, the fusible fleece, inside the fashion fabric, but on the other side of it, the lining side, there I have that fusible for the heavy tailoring, the solid tailoring. I have that armor weft inside there, which you certainly would never use in silky type fabrics ordinarily. But when it's a lining and I want to stiffen this as much as possible, then it is proper to use this. So you very often break the rules, because it works out really well to do this in any of them. They simply wouldn't be successful if they didn't have all this inside. Well, what I really wish that was that had been available when I did some of those quilteds, it's brand new. It's just out recently. I have bought all that I can get locally and have to look in some other stores if they don't get a quick supply again, because it is new and it's moving fast. It's this textured weft. And when I use this, it doesn't look like much. You know, it looks kind of thin. Doesn't look like there's much here, but it's very soft. It almost looks like a gauze bandage or something of that sort. And there is some loft there. It isn't real flat. There is some thickness there, but it's just beautifully soft. And I have just made about 3 garments real quickly with this, and I love the way it behaves. So what I'm saying is, new interfacings come out on the market all the time. Try them, because you don't know until you buy a yard or so and try it out how it's going to react and what you're going to find it useful for. But this is beautiful. I would use this for a lot of things. And one of the things that I would really like to use this for is some garments I've already made, and it's too late. I'm not going to take them apart and redo it. But I am definitely using it right now for the hand wovens. Let's see a couple on models. And these hand wovens are so loosely woven in these 2 garments that if they didn't have fusible interfacing under them to hold them together, I might have a hard time keeping them from falling apart. Now what I have used in those, I didn't want them strictly tailored. I didn't want them to be too stiff at all. And so what I've put in those is the fusy knit, and it held well. But this I would rather have, because it would remain really soft and it would hold it together nicely, but it would also give a little bit of loft. And the same would be for a lot of the quilteds. This would be a good choice. Now, after I have made my choices, then I'm going to define it down. Now, I have a huge interfacing cabinet, I must admit, at home. I also have all this horizontal storage down here where I have the bolts. When they're too big to fold up and put in my cabinet, I have bolts down there in the bottom of this horizontal storage. So that makes it really nice, because I do use so much of that. But if I have any doubts about some new ones on the market, or what I'm going to put in a particular thing, before I would buy a few yards of it, it might be a good idea to be able to test it. Well, there's a little kit like this that you can get. Look for them in the interfacing departments of any of the stores. And what this is obviously test fuse. It's for testing. And what's inside this box? A group of samples. And what I've done with all of these is number them because I wanted to be sure that I knew, let's see, which side, here are the numbers, okay, over here. What we have here is a description of each one and the uses and exactly whether it's a warm fuse or a cool fuse, what kind of iron you want to have. What I've done in one corner is cut off a little piece of all those and put them in here so I won't get them confused, so I won't get them mixed up. They come all together with a little paper clip there, and I'm going to keep them that way so that they stay in the right order in case you have any doubts about what it is. But beyond that, I've also numbered them. This one says number 1. I've put a number 1 on the top sheet. The second one is 2, and so on. So they're all numbered. I can't get confused. When I find one that I really like for some project, that's when I'll go to the store and buy a few yards or whatever I need of that particular one to have it not only for that project, but probably for some other projects as well. But anyway, they give you really good information about just what you need to know about how to buy it, how to fuse it, how to handle it, how to pre-treat it, and what care it will get afterwards. So what I'm going to do with this test fuse, for instance, if I want to use this wool crepe and make a suit out of it, it would be deciding, okay, exactly which one of these am I going to use. Remember, I said right at the first, if it's strictly tailored, I'm going to use one of these 3 choices, probably. There are some other choices first, or also, but I just narrowed it down to these 3 because they're all likely ones. This one was the Armo weft, and these are the 2 new ones here, the satin weave and the flex weave. And so these would all be good choices. So I'm going to fuse a little patch, about a 3-inch square will do it. Fuse a patch on this and then give it some testing. For instance, I want to see after I fuse these patches down. And to fuse them, you simply follow directions. Just make sure you have some steam in your iron, or else use a press cloth that's slightly damp, and I'm just going to fuse them. And when you put the iron down on it, by the way, don't move it around. As you're fusing it, just put it down. These are already fused. But just put the iron down and hold it there and count as high as they say to count. And what fuses this and does a really good job is the combination of factors. I want to have the right temperature. Usually you fuse most of these fabrics with it on a wool setting, but not always. Some of the new cool fuses, those you might put on a lighter weight or a lighter heat control, one that's not quite as warm. And so I want to make sure I have the right one, but you just hold it there so it's the right heat, it's pressure. I'm going to push a little bit so that I really push it down in. It's also some steam, and it's some time too, so be sure you count the right number of seconds so that it does fuse well. And then after you're finished and it's all cooled off, then inspect it to see what you think about it. I'm going to, for instance, squeeze each one to see if I like the way it feels, to see how the hand is, the way it looks and feels. I'm going to see if any of them peel off, because if they peel off easily, and these aren't peeling off at all, they're really fused. If it peels off, that means several things. Maybe I just didn't do a good job, or maybe it isn't the best interfacing for this fabric, and so I'll try some other ones. I also want to think about the color. Right now, what happens if I put it down here? Well, I'm not going to wear it over a white table, and so this middle one that completely disappears, that white one, that looks the nicest here. But if I would put this over something darker, then it shows up like a sore thumb, and the other 2 blend in better. So it depends on what you have under it. This is going to be a suit. I really don't want this interfacing to show because it's utilitarian. It isn't meant to be pretty in there. It's just meant to make a really good garment. I would instead put it over my lining and see which one goes best over the lining. And in this case, the 2 gray ones look too dark. In this case, I need a white interfacing there. This is why I keep so many on hand, because you need different ones for each fabric and for every different style. So it's nice to have just the right one by having a good assortment there. So this is how I would try it out. Now I might do something further than beyond this point. What I also might do, depending on how that felt, if for instance that felt a little bit too stiff for me, maybe I don't want to then put it on the straight The interfacing is on the straight here, and the fabric is on the straight grain. Maybe I don't want to put it together that way because that does make it stiffer. What would be softer is, it's still straight grain of the fabric here because of course that's how you're going to cut it out for the garment. But I might want to cut this interfacing, as you can kind of tell by the grain lines. I might want to cut it on the bias because it's considerably softer cut on the bias, fused that way, than this one is that's on the straight. So this is another possibility. The possibilities are always endless when you sew. This is why all of us who sew are such intelligent people, because we need to make all these choices and make them so that they actually are valid, so they work out. Isn't that right? Okay, then when you get that all decided and we actually have it cut out, they tell you exactly how. In all of these bolts, there's a nice little wrapper that goes right along with it, every inch along the way. And this tells how to interface with these fusibles. And they tell you to pre-shrink it. Now, some of these you can dip in water and they actually might shrink. Others you can pre-shrink just the way you're told, and it really doesn't do a whole lot. But at least you tried. Very often what I do instead is shrink this with the iron as I'm doing the fusing. Now, I would pre-shrink it in water if this is going to be a washable garment. It might be a good idea. But these dry cleanable ones I often fuse at the time of the fusing. Now notice how this one that I have here is a little bit longer than this little miniature top that I'm going to fuse it to. Naturally, you fuse the business side of that fusible, the gluey side. You put that on the back side of your fabric. The front side of the fabric is here. So you put it against the back side of the fabric. I sometimes cut it exactly the same size. Sometimes I cut it just a tiny bit smaller around the edges to make sure it won't peek out and get any of the fusible on the ironing board. But I almost always cut it a little bit longer at the bottom. Now this is a miniature. If I would be making a suit jacket like the one I'm wearing, I would cut it probably a ½ inch longer because I might expect that much shrinkage in this much length. It comes way down below my hips, way down into the thigh area. I might expect a ½ inch of shrinkage there. What I'm going to do then is some of it shrinks, some of it does not. What I'm going to do is shoot some steam into it as I put it down here, and I'm going to do this by holding the iron a little above it before I actually put the iron down and fuse it. And I'll start up in the shoulder area. And by the time I get down to the next one, of course I would have a large jacket, not this small one. By the time I get down here and do the same thing, if it's going to shrink, I can already see it creeping up on the bottom. And by the time I fuse every area along the way and do the same thing, you can see it moving a little bit right now. It's coming up just a little bit shorter. So this is a small distance. It isn't going to shrink much. But the reason I do this, shrink it with the steam first before I actually touch it, is because I only want to shrink this interfacing. I don't want to shrink the wool or whatever fabric is underneath because I've already pre-treated that. I don't want it to pull together along with the interfacing. So this is why you do it in this way, and it turns out beautifully every time. If I had a full-length coat, I might cut it as much as an inch longer. It is very likely that when I get down to the bottom, I'll have to trim off a little bit of that, but that's quite all right. It's better to have it there than to run short. So that's how I would fuse it and do the same things in other parts of the garment that need it. What I also have then in all these suits is a little strip in the hem. And let's say the hem is about 1.5 inches, which this is. And I'm going to just give it a light press here, just so that I know where that line's going to be is what I would do on my garment. And then I want to make sure to cut this bias strip of interfacing about 1 inch wider than what my hem will be. So if this is 1.5 inches, I want this to be 2.5 inches. I want to put it right over the top like this, and most of it's going to be up here in the garment. Just about 1/2 inch is going to extend down into the fold, so that when this folds up, I have it down a little too far, so that when I fuse this and I fold up the hem, I'll be able to catch stitch that hem to the interfacing, not to the outside garment, and that's how you don't see where the hem is in a suit, because you've done that just right. So this is the kind of fusing I'm going to do and the kind of interfacings that I'm going to use, and hopefully everything that I do in the future will turn out just right. You and I know both that it won't. We're going to have mistakes now and then, but at least you have really done a nice educated choice if you do all these things that I've been telling you and try it out. Now beyond this, I'm going to do some underlinings in some of these garments. Remember a pink suit I had on last week? A dress, really, a two-piece dress. It was this silk, and it's really thin. Now, it wouldn't hold up at all without something under it. This is where I might put this sew-in sheer. It's not a fusible. It's a very sheer piece of fabric here, but it gives some body. And how I would do that is, first of all, stay stitch it together. Here I just have some other choices like silk organza or net or whatever. But I would just stay stitch the two together and treat them as one fabric thereafter. And it gives it a lot more body, and it's going to hold up well, and it's not going to wrinkle and look miserable when I travel to the other end of the line. What I also do with this, if there are any darts, and remember I had several darts in that, what I would do with this is wherever there's a dart, I don't know how easily you can see this, maybe on this side better, I'm going to take big machine stitches right through the center of that dart and a little beyond the tip of it. And then when I fold the dart and sew it on machine, if the tip comes out right here, the two layers will stick together beautifully. If I didn't do that, if I would just put them together and fold it like this and stitch, more than likely when I come down to the point of the dart, I would only be stitching that underlining and the fashion fabric would have pulled away. So you want to do a really good job there after you're finished. Go ahead and pull out the basting thread. You don't need it anymore. Well, there are some garments that really have no structure inside whatsoever. They're just soft. They hang on your body and assume your shape. Next time we'll explore mesh fabrics and see what to do with them. Come join me.